On paper, the American Sherman had no business on the Eastern Front. Against the feared Tiger, it was outgunned and out-armored, and every crew knew it. Yet whole guards units traded their own tanks for it, and the men who got one fell for it hard. The reason had nothing to do with the gun or the armor. They loved it for the one thing a tank is never built to be. Start with the number, because the number is the surprise. The United States shipped 4,102 of the diesel Sherman east under Lend-Lease. Soviet clerks signed for 3,664. The gap, more than 400 tanks, went to the bottom in torpedoed convoys before it ever saw Russia. Of the ones that landed, roughly 2,653 reached frontline units. That is more American armor than any other single tank the Soviets took in the entire war. Nearly 1 in 5 of every Lend-Lease Sherman ever built rolled east, not west. The men called it the Emcha, and they said it with affection. The name comes from the Russian for M4, run together into one word. The man who wrote the Emcha's story down was Dmitriy Loza. Loza commanded a Sherman battalion from the autumn of 1943 to the last day of the war. Ukraine, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, then the streets of Vienna. He had 3 Shermans shot out from under him and climbed out of every one. He finished the war, a hero of the Soviet Union. Decades later, he wrote down exactly what his crews thought of the American tank. His memoir is why we can say what the crews believed instead of guessing. Loza was honest about the tank's one real weakness, so start there. Against a Tiger, the Sherman lost the paper fight, and lost it badly. The Tiger's 88mm gun could open a Sherman at a range where the Sherman's own round still bounced off the Tiger's front plate. Even the outgunned Sherman, the 76mm version, could not count on a frontal kill against a German heavy. The Soviets knew this. They did not hand the Emcha to their crews because it won duel. Why did the crews want it? Because it did the boring things, and the boring things are what keep a crew alive and moving. Take the steel first. When a German round struck a T-34 and did not punch through, the inside of the armor could still shed splinters. Those splinters flew off the wall and struck the men at their stations, in the hands and in the eyes, even though the tank was never penetrated. Loza said plainly this did not happen inside the Sherman. American armor was softer and cleaner steel, and it held together when it was hit. A crew that took a non-penetrating strike in a Sherman stayed at their gun. In a T-34, the same strike could take a gunner out of the fight with the hull still intact. Same hit, 2 different outcomes, and one of them costs you a trained crewman you never see replaced. There was fire, too. Fire was the fear every tanker carried into the hull. Loza said the Emcha was slower to burn than the tanks he had known before. The later Shermans stored their shells in bins jacketed with water. A hit that reached the ammunition did not always touch off the whole load. A crew that takes a penetrating strike and gets a few seconds to climb clear is a crew you keep. That handful of seconds was the difference the men remembered. The American gun sights were simply better ground glass than the Soviet factories were making in 1943. Nobody wrote down how many extra yards of clear sighting that bought a Soviet gunner, and it would be dishonest to invent the figure. What the crews reported matters more than a number. They saw the target first. In a tank fight, the crew that lays the gun first and fires first usually decides how it ends. A clearer sight is a head start on every engagement before a shell is even loaded. Every Sherman that came off the ship carried a radio set, one for every tank. Early in the war, a Soviet tank platoon was lucky to have a radio in the commander's machine and hand signals for the rest. A platoon that can talk can react to a threat on the flank in seconds. A platoon following the lead tank by watching its turret reacts in minutes, and minutes are what get tanks lost. The Emcha gave every crew a voice in the fight before the Soviets could build enough sets to do the same. Comfort is the thing the crews talked about most, and it is the thing you would least expect to win a war. The Sherman was comfortable. The fighting compartment was roomy where the T-34 was cramped. The hatches worked. The seats were padded. There was room to service the gun without three men fouling each other. It sounds soft to care about a padded seat in a war. Exhaustion says otherwise. A rested crew reacts faster on the 10th hour of a road march than one already worn thin. The Emcha let its men reach the fight with something left. That is the one thing the tank was never built to be. American designers built the Sherman to be easy on the men who rode it, because that was the American way of building. The Soviets built the T-34 to be cheap and quick to replace. The crews got a taste of the American priority and never wanted to give it back. The engine tells the same story. The Soviet Sherman ran on a pair of General Motors diesel engines, together making about 400 horsepower. Two things came from that. First, it burned diesel. That was the same fuel the T-34 drank. A Sherman unit did not need a second fuel chain running behind it. Every other American tank in the war ran on gasoline, and the Soviets asked for the diesel model on purpose. Second, it had two engines instead of one. Take a hit to one, or throw a breakdown, and the tank still limped off the field on the other. Lose the only engine in a single-engine tank, and you have a pillbox waiting to be abandoned. The Sherman that lost one could still be recovered and back in the line inside a week. Two tanks running against one written off. Over a month of hard use. That is a whole company the enemy never sees coming back. And it kept running. That is the word the crews came back to. Reliability. The Emcha would road march long distances and still start in the morning. The crews were grateful for a machine that fired up on a frozen morning without a fight. The narrow-track T-34 was the better cross-country machine in soft ground, and Loza admitted the American tank had its faults. It sat taller and flipped over more easily on a bad slope, and it could not spin on the spot the way a T-34 could. But the Sherman broke down less on the long hauls between fights. Proof came in August of 1945. Loza's corps drove into Manchuria across the Greater Khingan Range. Hundreds of miles of mountain and desert in a matter of days. A tank army does not cross ground like that on a machine it has to nurse. A tank that is in the shop is worth nothing that week. A tank that starts every morning is worth its whole crew. Even the tracks tell you what the crews valued, and the tracks were the Sherman's worst habit. The rubber block tracks rode quiet and smooth on a road, far gentler than the steel tracks of a T-34. On a frozen road they were a menace. Loza said steering the Emcha on the ice was like handling a cow on ice with nothing to bite. The Americans heard the complaint. The next shipment arrived with spare track blocks fitted with spikes. The crews bolted them in when winter came, and the tank gripped the frozen road again. Heat brought the opposite failure. Crossing Romania in the summer of 1944 and again in Manchuria in August of 1945, the rubber on the tracks and road wheels overheated and tore apart. The crews knew every one of these faults. They rated the tank anyway. The faults were fixable, and the virtues were not the kind you can bolt on later. Look at where the Emcha went, and you can see the Soviet verdict without a single quote. The Red Army sent it to its best. Loza's own 233rd Tank Brigade was fully equipped with the M4A2. His later command was the 46th Guards Tank Brigade of the 9th Guards Mechanized Corps, and it took the outgunned 76mm Shermans into the fight for Hungary and Austria. In January of 1945, one corps carried 176 Shermans on its book. 108 of them were the 76mm version. Those were the ones expected to do the hardest fighting. An army fighting for its life does not hand its guard divisions a tank it cannot trust. The Emcha went to the units the Red Army needed most. Of the Shermans that shipped, 2,095 carried the 76mm gun. 2,007 carried the older 75. The Soviets asked for the bigger gun as fast as the factories could fit it. They were not blind to the tank's one real weakness. They wanted the reliable hull with the clear sights and the best gun they could get bolted into it. They took the machine that kept the crew fighting and tried to close the one gap that machine had. So the verdict from the men who actually rode it was never about winning a duel with a tiger. Loza and his crews knew that duel was a grim bet, and they planned around it. What they praised was the tank that started every morning, that let them see first and shoot first, that held together when it was struck, and that delivered them to the fight, rested instead of wrung out. The men trusted it. The Guards units that could have any tank in the inventory kept asking for the American one. The Sherman was outclassed on the one page everyone reads, the page with the gun and the armor. It won the argument on every other page. The armor and the gun decide a single engagement. A tank that still runs and a crew that can still see decide the 10 that follow. There are always more of those. Dmitriy Loza spent 2 years learning that lesson. He learned it in a tank the Americans built for comfort and the Russians kept for war. The thing his crews loved most was the thing no spec sheet ever lists. It brought them home to fight again tomorrow.